Hello everyone, and thank you for coming to our channel. In today's video, we'll discuss how, when two mummified bodies were discovered, people claimed they held the key to a mysterious legend. 300 years after a sad love story happened in Spain, people are now fixing up the San Pedro church in the city. But as they dig around the old building, they find two sets of bones that belong to people. We're going to talk about this interesting story today. So, let's start by watching the whole video. Thanks to this discovery, a mysterious piece of Spanish folklore whose truth has long been debated may have just become very real. When two mummified bodies were found, people in the area said that they were the key to a mysterious legend. Yes, finding the mummified bodies could answer questions that have been on the minds of the Spanish for a long time. Tourists have been going to the city that was the setting for a story that is not only romantic, but also thrilling and sad, for years and even today. The story in question began in the early 1200s, when the Marcilla and Segura families were both at the top of Terrible's social hierarchy. In theory, a marriage between a man from the Marcilla family and a woman from the Segura family wouldn't be a bad thing because it would likely increase the power and influence of both families. Even though one of them was no longer very wealthy, the couple's forbidden love continued. It's even said that they were reunited in public, but it wasn't a happy ending. When the two sets of remains were found at the site of the San Pedro church, questions were raised about the relationship. The fact that they had a crush on each other didn't bother anyone because they were both from the same social circle. However, by the time they were old enough to get married, Diego's family had hit a rough patch, which meant they no longer had the wealth that once defined them. As a result, Isabel's father forbade Diego from marrying Isabel, but this didn't stop Diego. Still, the young woman had no plans to give her life to another person. She wrote this letter to her father to tell him that she wanted to stay single until she was 20. Waiting for Diego for so long would also give her time to learn how to be a good housewife. Isabel's father didn't want her to marry Diego, but he loved his daughter very much, so he agreed to her request. He and Isabel waited 5 years for the Marcilla boy to return, but during that time, no one heard from Diego. Diego's silence left the Segura family in the lurch. Also, Isabel's 20th birthday was coming up, which meant that the 5-year promise was coming to an end. In the end, the Seguras found another respectable suitor named Don Pedro de Azagra from Albarazan, and he and Isabel went on the last day of the half-decade in which Diego could have won her hand. Just as the ceremony ended, though, there was a disturbance at the gates of Terrible, and guards told the Segura family that a familiar face. Diego didn't want to give up on Isabel, so the night after she got married to his Agra, he sneaked into her room and begged her for a kiss, saying, "Kiss me, I'm dying." But since Isabel had just gotten married, she didn't want to break her promise to his Agra, so she told Diego that God wouldn't want her to lie to her husband. Instead, she begged Diego to move on with his life. "If our love can't make God happy, it shouldn't make me happy either." The story goes that when Isabel said no, Diego had nothing left to live for. He couldn't stand the thought of being apart from Isabel forever, so he took his last breath and collapsed at her feet. He died in front of his loved one. As soon as Isabel realized Diego was dead, she felt a chill. She woke up her new husband, Azagra, and told him that his snoring had wakened her up. She also said that she wanted Azagra to tell her a story. After Azagra did as his new wife had asked, Isabel told him about how Diego had come into their bedroom and kissed her. There, she wore her wedding dress and walked down the aisle again. This time, though, she walked up to the body of her lifelong love, whose body was at the front of the church. Diego may have died, but she hadn't. Isabel felt she owed Diego one last kiss, the one she hadn't given him in life. But as soon as she did, she died on top of Diego's body and fell asleep with the man she had always loved. Shortly after their deaths, the townspeople called for a joint burial so that the lovers could be together forever, even though they didn't get to be together in life. In 1560, Isabel and Diego's bodies were put on display in the church so that people could pay their respects. Be Isabel and Diego, buried in tombs worthy of their ostensibly epic love story. The fancy grave chambers are the work of 20th century sculptor Juan de Valles, who also carved the Segura family crest on Isabel's tomb and the Marcilla clan's arms on Diego's. The most eye-catching part of the monuments has to be the carved figures on top of each one. These models are meant to look like the famous couple, with the sculpture of Diego reaching toward the one that looks like it's of Isabel. However, there's a very interesting detail. The Davalos made this choice out of respect for religious rules. Since Isabel was married to someone else, she couldn't touch Diego in life or death, no matter how beautiful the tomb was. Some people still thought the story was too good to be true, and not everyone was sure that the bodies inside belonged to Isabel and Diego. In 2015, historian Fernando Lopez Regidal set out to prove once and for all whether this was the case. He did this by doing his own study on the bodies that had long been thought to be Isabel and Diego's, and by working with archaeologists. Skeptics have said, for example, that in 1353, Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio wrote a very similar story called Girolamo e Salvestre. In his version of the story, Boccaccio wrote a much sexier version of the well-known events, which is an interesting counter-argument for those who think the lovers of terror really existed. It's also been said that the original story was written by a woman who was possessed by a demon. Writers have been interested in forbidden love for a long time. Romeo and Juliet, for example, is also about a young couple who fall in love and then die. And just as people go to Verona to see what is said to be Juliet's famous balcony, the lovers of the play have continued to bring attention to the small Spanish city of Isabel and Diego. Famous playwright Tirso de Molina wrote about the legend in 1635. A couple of centuries later, Juan Eugenio Hearst adapted the lovers' story for the stage. With so many people knowing about Isabel and Diego's legend, Terrible continues to celebrate its claim to fame around Valentine's Day every year. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.